Starting so now. Good morning. It's the morning after the general election, and we're still trying to make sense of it all. I'm Dr Thevoz of Oxford University.
I'm Dr Blaxill of both universities in Cambridge.
And this is really just us knocking about some thoughts on what happened last night.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's really, we're going to go through each party and have a little chat about, I suppose, how we think they did relative to our expectations.
Yep.
And then maybe try and proceed with some more, I'm calling it advanced analysis to actually work out why this election happened the way it would be, which I think is it's an extremely confusing election. In the one thing, and I'm sure we'll talk on this, is seemingly actually the absence of anything in the way of really sort of national swings or anything of that kind. I mean, there might be demographic variations, like for example the behaviour of the youth vote, which only more number crunching can really reveal. But this is just an instant reaction, so we're just literally having to fly by the seat of our pants.
And I've found this certainly the most unpredictable election in my lifetime, and working with psephologists who go back quite a few decades.
I would say that in the post-1945 period, this would be the one with the weakest form of any kind of national swing whatsoever, or shall we say, even a short journey up the road,
or even regional
much
swing.
More divergent swing. Yeah. Exactly.
That's very
and so there's a heterogeneous nature to this in terms of the vote movement.
Shall we start with what happens to the UKIP vote? I mean, there was always some interesting stuff because UKIP weren't standing in, I think it was 177 seats or thereabouts, so that already skews things up a bit in terms of where the UKIP vote goes to. But then the UKIP vote collapses where they are standing, and
this is the single most interesting thing I think about the election. I mean, we'll obviously come into really explaining why Labour did so much better in this election than we were thinking, but one of the real things here that we should say, and this was predicted by the polls, is that both main parties have gone up quite substantially. We're looking at 83% of the vote between Party 1 and 2. This is back into the 1970s here in terms of that performance. And so the biggest movement that you've seen is the unwinding of the UKIP vote. Now, the opinion polls before the election were suggesting, and indeed even direct polling with UKIP voters, that this was breaking 70% of the Conservatives plus. It looks as though it's much more 50-50, maybe even a slight advantage to Labour. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why Labour have done much better than expected. And one theory that I have here, and this would have to be corroborated by more analysis, is the places where Labour, shall we say, UKIP got a swing from Labour in 2015, and the UKIP bubble inflated, that it's correspondingly deflated in favour of Labour in this election. So Labour have gained most in those places where they previously lost to UKIP. But I think that might help explain it a bit. That
does say something, though, about where the UKIP vote has been coming from, because there was certainly, when UKIP had their breakthrough in 1999 in the Euro elections, there was a perception that they were the party of the Shires. Nigel Farage was, the sort of poster boy for these golf club playing people from the home counties who normally voted Tory, and that was pretty true, actually, of UKIP throughout the 2000s. But when they get their really big breakthrough in the 2010s, then you start to see their support starts to come 50-50 from Labour and Conservatives. Now, there was this assumption by pollsters, and of course polls are fantastic at telling you what has happened. They're quite bad as a predictor of what is going to happen. And there does seem to have been this assumption by pollsters that because of the nature of the Brexit issue and the nature of UKIP as a single issue party and so on, that all this would go straight, or disproportionately, let's say 2/3 to the Conservatives.
Or UKIP would
act. Not happened at all.
The UKIP would act somehow as a kind of a gateway drug, that someone who was Labour would go to UKIP and then go to the Conservatives. It seems that the UKIP vote has been much more solidly repatriated back to its sort of Labour origin than we would expect. I mean, obviously some of it, maybe older vote, has gone back to the Conservatives as well. I'm sure there has been some taking the Conservatives have taken some of that, but clearly that's been one of the really, really significant things, that vote, despite all of the criticisms about the way the Labour were conducting things, and of course the ambiguous position of the party on Europe, which actually seems to, if anything, maybe have paid off, because Labour maybe have taken some of the angry Remain vote, yet at the same time it haven't seemed to have damaged their ability to take back UKIP votes simultaneously. And you could say that was a masterstroke, even though it was really a result just of pure indecision.
And that's one of the classic dilemmas facing any party coalition, which is, on the one hand, you want to be a broad enough coalition attracting so many disparate elements. I mean, New Labour is the classic huge broad brush coalition where it's practically impossible in the late 1990s to not believe in something which vaguely comes into some part of New Labour's orbit. But on the other hand, if you get so broad, these disparate parts have nothing in common, and you start to see that with the unwinding of the Labour coalition under Gordon Brown in particular. Now, Labour still have this dilemma. They have it over Europe, they have it over the economy, and you're getting this with the people who are professing undying obedience to Jeremy Corbyn this morning in quite extraordinary displays from people who were roundly condemning him only 48 hours ago.
Yeah, of course. And of course, because Corbyn has had this miraculous ability here somehow to essentially move the centre of left-wing politics, and as a consequence, as you say, that these previous rebels are now expressing extreme loyalty. The one other last point I make about UKIP, now UKIP have gone down to about 2% of the vote nationally, and one thing I would be quite interested in, bizarrely enough, in academic question, who are the people who are still voting UKIP? And it's interesting that it was assumed that UKIP withdrawals, i.e. UKIP not putting up a candidate at all, would help the Conservatives because there would be more of a critical mass to go back to the Conservatives. I don't think that's actually necessarily true. I think the opposite might be true, and it actually might be that the squashed UKIP vote might just be a much more generally alienated vote, which might find its home more easily in Labour, which really makes us recalibrate what the UKIP phenomenon is and indeed actually ever was.
But also the knock-on effect of this. I mean, there's something about popular votes rising. This is one of the things that gets very misleading when you look at elections. There's a huge emphasis on percentages and there's a huge emphasis on swing, and it often conceals the fact that turnout goes right up and down, and a lot of it comes down to, does your vote actually bother turning up? Now here, there's been a huge hike in turnout in a huge number of seats in particular. We go maybe into more of that, but also this UKIP effect has seen both major parties increase their vote, and a lot of this comes down to how the UKIP vote split.
How it divided the pie, exactly. And in some cases, the Conservatives seem to take most of it. Sometimes Labour. I think that you might be able, as I say, to correlate that with where the UKIP vote might have come from in 2015, which is to say, as I say, if more of that was red before, I think it's probably red now.
And of course we're just looking at the top line figures we're getting this morning. There are going to be all sorts of cross-voting patterns that happen as
and there'll
with
be
the last
a lot
election.
in the way of, I suppose, interviews with particular target groups, and of course one of those is young people. Shall we move away from UKIP into one of the other parties?
You started on Labour. Shall we
continue talking about Labour? I mean, Labour are really the big story of this election, of course. I mean, achieving projection I've got is 268 seats, I believe, something like that. Labour's strongest performances in London by a country mile, some really staggering swings in London, 1997-esque swings. And I think the Conservatives have got the worst result they've had in London, I think, since 1945. I mean, the Conservatives managed to hold a few North London seats that looked as though they were going to lose, which was Hendon, Finchley, Chipping Barnet. But even given that, they're still in a really poor position. They did a lot better than was expected in Wales as well, despite dire opinions. And something really weird happened in Scotland, which was that the Conservatives took a huge chunk out of the SNP. Labour remained static, and this let Labour through the middle in, I think, 6 seats, and also has moved the effective sort of Labour SNP battle line in the seats that Labour didn't quite squeak home really, really close together, to the extent that if Labour get a good swing in another election, they can become the first party of Scotland again. Labour can now get Scotland back. That's one of the effects of this.
One of the problems is when you hear politicians talk about how everything's so close around here and the result was so tight, that's usually a really poor predictor of what's going to be close next time. We saw so many close fights this time round, and indeed places that were really close last time round with whopping majorities. I mean, you had Ealing Central, which had, I think, a 42 vote majority and has been up to 13,000 this time round. You had a
Stephen Pound, right?
No, that's not that. No, that's next door. It's up. This is Rupert Hook's seat. And you've got Wes Streeting up in Ilford North, who had
Hampstead and Highgate's another one.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Seat. That's also gone extremely safe.
All of these things have had huge swings on them. And again, City of Chester, that had a double-digit majority and has been had a 10,000 majority, I think. So all of these places, the movements are so huge that actually the party tactics around telling you and informing the electorate how to vote smartly and tactically are often out of date.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's a general truism that the further north you're going, the better the Conservatives are doing. I mean, the Conservatives had a very mixed bag relative to expectations in the Midlands. Although in the northeast and northeast certainly the Conservatives didn't necessarily translate so much into seats, but they did certainly get some healthy swings there. So the Midlands are really mixed bag. I mean, the Conservatives did get some gains in the Midlands, like Walsall North, for example, and
but they were
Derby.
very heavily targeting the northeastern seats, particularly the ones with a strong Brexit vote. And in places like Darlington, places like Hartlepool, which had been very heavily trailed, they failed to make that breakthrough. And in some cases, there was actually a slight swing back to Labour.
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, generally against Labour-facing seats in England, I mean, the Conservatives obviously very very disappointed. I mean, they got very, very little.
Yep.
And of course they lost ground in many cases. I mean, against the SNP in Scotland, the Conservatives did fantastically.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know what the percentage swing overall to the Conservatives was, but it might be in the region of 12, 13%, something like that. And as I say, one of the effects of this is, as well as the Conservatives have gained a handsome number of seats in Scotland, I believe 12, they've also helped Labour come through the middle.
Yep.
To take a bunch of seats back, and also to move that battle line, which is the important thing. Now, in a way, that's good. Might not be good for the Conservatives in a partisan sense, but it's good for unionism. Yep. In the sense, and I guess they ought to care about that. So it's a triumph for the Conservatives in Scotland, not relative to expectations, pretty poor elsewhere. Although in many respects, we have to remember the overall seat tallies in this election between Labour and Conservative are actually very similar to 2010, and all of these elections we've had in the noughties. Actually, there's not an enormous seat tally difference between Labour and Conservative. Sure, there's churn amongst the parties outside the big two. But
what about, I mean, going back to Labour, how they've managed to do this? I mean, their popular vote is phenomenal in some inner city seats. I mean, constituencies with a popular vote of over 40,000, which just hasn't been seen very often.
So East Ham has a majority of nearly 40,000.
Yeah. But populations of seats until recently were only about 55,000, so it used to be impossible to even get that many votes.
Yep. Oh no, certainly. I mean, actually, I'm not sure about the nature of the distribution of the vote. It does seem that Labour did do quite well in marginals. I mean, whether that's because of targeted resources or just being a little bit fortunate. But you are right that in terms of these inner city seats, which are now the new Labour bastions. I mean, there are some seats, I suppose, like Ashfield, for example. That was the Conservatives came within 400 votes of taking out an ex-Coalfield seat, Goria do Pioro's seat. I mean, that was one of the ones that the Conservatives did register a very good result in. Some of the seats, I suppose, like that, and even like, I believe, Great Grimsby, the Conservatives also got one of the Stoke seats as well. Those are now much more viable for the Conservatives, infinitely more so than some of these much more affluent inner city seats. So that cosmopolitanism trend away from the Conservatives has continued very strongly.
What's quite interesting with this is if we follow the polls, and actually a number of the polls against the naysayers, including myself, have tracked this very dramatic change in Labour fortunes quite recently. If we assume that there has been a really successful campaign by Labour, how much of it is the preparedness of the parties? Because something that came through very clearly speaking to Conservatives was that local Conservative associations, even in the key marginals, knew nothing about an election coming on, as neither did the Labour Party. But this seems to have been a test of what the party machineries in the country are like with a snap election.
Maybe. I mean, obviously the Conservative strategy is a more intelligence-led, focus, key target voter strategy. Labour is a boots-on-the-ground kind of strategy.
More or less. I mean, I think a large part of it, the Conservatives do outsource a lot of their campaigning capacity because it's done at a very national level with very strategic planning and very centralised resources. And Labour's extremely centralised in their own way. However, there's less hiring major consultancies to actually do the bulk of the messaging and the targeting and the campaigning. And as a result, I wonder whether this says something about Labour's in-house campaigning capacity. Because I can remember, back in as recently as 2010, we were all talking about how Labour was in the doldrums, and in 2015 in Scotland, how Labour was in the doldrums and clearly knew nothing about how to run elections anymore. And well, we're not so sure now. I mean, they seem to have beaten the Conservatives at their own game.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it could be through intelligence, or it could just simply be through raw enthusiasm and putting boots on the ground. And that's, of course, one of the things that that may indeed have propelled. We're talking again about Labour, and we talked about the UKIP unwind. I mean, we should also, I suppose, talk. We don't have figures for this, but it seems that one of the factors that has likely inflated the turnout is the youth vote coming out to a much greater extent than the 43% or whatever it was in the last election. And if that's true, then anecdotally, presumably, that is the effect of Corbynism. Now, I suppose the interesting thing is why that isn't really picked up by the opinion polls until very late in the day. I mean, more broadly, one of the things that Labour have managed to do, obviously they could never have intended this, but the thing is, because they put on all their support really late in the campaign, and really only some opinion polls during the campaign have picked this up, that the fact that they've almost been able to ambush the Conservatives by putting on all this extra support, and that wasn't detected previously by the opinion polls, because if the youth vote was coming out for Corbyn, or if UKIP voters were breaking also for Labour, one assumes that those factors would have been priced into the polls beforehand, and then the Conservatives would have said, all right, we're not going to the country now. But because they all suddenly just appeared like that, like a couple of weeks or a week before polling, No one saw
Well,
it coming.
and also, you mentioned boots on the ground, and
The element of surprise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, a cynic like me would say, well, actually, what you need is hardened campaigners who understand how to launch a proper campaign, how to message properly, how to target properly, all these kinds of skills. But actually, with boots on the ground, it's not terribly skilled work most of the time. And as long as you've got some direction to the campaign, you can have an awful lot of difference that's made just by having a magnitude of extra foot soldiers who are there and able to campaign in that way. Now, again, the received wisdom, and this is as much about tracing where we've all gone wrong and not picking this up, but the received wisdom was, oh, well, this is only going to be focused in a few inner city urban areas that are already safely Labour, it's not going to matter.
Yeah,
and actually that's not the case.
As well.
So, let's look at some places like Canterbury, places like Brighton, Kent Town. I mean, shock Labour gains. Canterbury has never elected a Labour MP as long as it's been a constituency, which is 99 years.
Yeah.
This is extraordinary, and obviously there are a huge number of students who are there. They've made a very big difference.
I think that's another one you could look at is the presence of university or correlation between students and the population. I mean, that would then give a better idea as to whether, again, that sort of boots on the ground factor, unfocused though it might be, because of course we are living in some respects in the age of big rallies. I mean, you've obviously got what you've seen in America with Donald Trump, and the idea of, I suppose, huge unfocused electioneering power is again, of course, in the past this used to be a way of fighting elections, particularly on the radical end of the spectrum. Maybe that comes back into fashion now. I mean, only post-analysis will show the extent to which this youth vote, and this can be, of course, statistically analysed, and so we will then be able to see that. And if that youth vote has been engaged, the interesting thing is whether it will stay engaged.
I mean, you're interesting to raise the question of past practice, because we used to have a really participatory set of politics in the 19th century in the way elections were fought, but the key difference was the number of voters was tiny, and you'd often actually have, and the reason why we have this whole culture of door knocking is because you could actually feasibly knock on the door of everyone in a constituency if there were only 2,000 or 3,000 registered voters in the seat. And if you found that you actually had 5,000 volunteers, many of whom couldn't vote themselves but they were politically active, it was feasible to knock on someone's door several times and engage with every voter on that level. Now, the minute you move into mass politics in the modern age, post-1918, you're suddenly looking at it being completely impossible to pay that much attention to the individual voter. And I wonder whether there's an element of being able to catch up either through technology or through this kind of politics. I don't know whether it's particular to Corbyn or whether there is a right-wing alternative, if we see UKIP perhaps as a short-lived right-wing alternative.
It may be. I mean, but then there's also, I suppose, simply the holding of rallies. Regardless of whether the voters actually, say, live in that constituency, just simply the idea of the power of, I suppose, a sort of a mass political event and that ability to, somehow, I suppose, inspire people. Because I guess the effect of the rally is it's not going to win over swing voters. It's more likely to motivate you imagine voters that are inclined that way, and if there is a natural progressive majority that's sort of, I guess, latently there within the youth vote that doesn't vote, then in theory, although progressives have been talking about this for many years, being able to fire it out and get it up and get it to the polling station would be a winning strategy, and it could be that Mr. Corbyn has succeeded to a much greater extent than generations of his forebears.
And that's the question actually about rallies. I mean, if we raise the spectre of the Sheffield rally of 1992 and how that can be counterproductive, but then there's always the question, is a rally aimed at a wider audience in showcasing the party in a sort of controlled atmosphere, as parties try to do every year with their conferences increasingly, or is it about enthusing and motivating your base,
something more spontaneous?
They're pepped up and campaign.
Yeah, I mean, these are all really fascinating ways in which Corbyn has undoubtedly had the effect of changing politics, and of course we can.
I'm amazed we've moved to saying that so quickly.
That is undoubtedly the case. I mean,
48 hours ago we were saying he was finished.
Yeah, but he is part, though, of a wide. I mean, people have made these comparisons between Corbyn and Trump on a certain level because of this populist kind of approach, and this is a trend in many ways, and in a certain sense there is something larger happening here. I mean, of course, the thing is we can't really explain in many respects the Labour doing very well. I mean, there are several reasons. I mean, there's the UKIP unwind, there's the idea of the youth suddenly being infused. There, of course, we must consider Corbyn himself, which again would be unbelievable, that somehow a presidential appeal of this, and then of course the actual policies and the programme as well. We must take all of those things into account, but we can't isolate any single one of those factors.
No, indeed.
I mean, it's very difficult to explain it. And the other point I would make is that, again, with Trump or with Brexit, So this was, I guess, connected to a narrative insofar as you could see some of the rumblings of this happening. Okay, didn't think necessarily they would win, but with this surge from Corbyn, there was nothing. The only rumbles there were big, like, momentum rallies, which we all assumed were just preaching to the converted. There was no rumble at all, and then suddenly there was an earthquake 2 weeks before polling day, and then the ambush happens.
I wonder if it's worth bringing in.
You guys okay to stay outside?
I'm happy to stay
absolutely,
outside.
absolutely.
I'm warmed by...
Slightly cold.
Okay, no, we'll continue. So one of the things it might be interesting just to touch on is the increasing presidentialization of politics. Because if we're talking about Corbyn, and I think most academics tend to be a little bit skeptical about, some of these masterly charisma overwhelming everything. Now, I wonder whether there's something about Corbyn as a natural campaigner. And I don't mean it's necessarily that he's charismatic in the sort of conventional sense, but this is a guy who spent most of his career as a backbench campaigning MP, going from one rally to the next, pursuing one cause after the next. And in a way we hadn't really appreciated, I think he more or less came into his own during the campaign. He was very much at ease in a way that Theresa May very much wasn't. And I don't know whether this might be a useful segue onto the Conservatives and what went on there.
Maybe. I mean, I suppose the Conservative method of conducting the campaign was very much, I suppose, a traditional leader-centric campaign where you staged managed it very carefully and used the image of the leader rather than this campaigning kind of snowball approach that Corbyn has used, which actually, ironically, while of course he is important in it, it doesn't have the same kind of egomaniac kind of feel that the Conservative campaign had, which was a much more traditionally presidential campaign of the kind that we have come to expect. The Corbyn campaign was much more of a, not necessarily even demagogic is maybe the wrong word, but I mean there's a certain,
it was
as
intense.
you say,
it had something of the sort of Jesuit priest of the 17th century with religious fervour in terms of pursuing a cause of righteousness. I mean, one of the many things thrown at Corbyn, which I think is quite fair, is his lack of humour. He's not somebody who cracks jokes very easily.
He's also a really poor public speaker. I mean, the bit when you see the recording on the news where he demands Theresa May's resignation in a really anemic way. He says, "I think she should go." Quite frankly,
but he's intense, and there is a sincerity about that intensity, which clearly has a following. And contrast that with Theresa May. I mean, not only did they run this much more conventional campaign, but they really hacked off the press with this whole sort of strategy of holding tight and thinking, well, we're ahead, so we've got nothing to lose by not answering questions, stage managing things, holding journalists' microphones for them and taking them away if they
not producing
an
alluring manifesto. With, if anything, I mean, again, some of the things like the so-called stuff with the dementia tax. I mean, again, one suspects that they put this in the manifesto thinking they were going to win, and that makes them easier to go and do it, for them to go and do it later. If they were making a populist manifesto, they wouldn't have put that there.
But there's also,
whereas Labour's manifesto was, of course, very populist.
Well, it was populist, but there was some fascinating little cross-dressing going on here and there, because the degree to which the Conservatives were actually advancing a fairly left-wing manifesto in a number of ways around social justice themes, and the degree to which the Labour Party, of all things, found itself defending the principle of inherited wealth against the Conservatives in opposition to the dementia tax. The lines are getting blurred. This isn't, straightforward left-right. It's maybe on an emotional level left-right, and this is where we get into narrative framing, into psychology, into personal identification. But it's not, on an objective. If we were to try and draw a graph as to where all these things stand.
Well, no, clearly. I mean, and the thing is if we start talking about, left and right in politics and the connection with that general sort of economic base, then we actually find that the correlation between affluence and propensity to support Labour or the Conservatives is now really extremely weak, or much weaker than it has been. I'm sure it exists still there on a certain level, but so hence the conventional way in which we conceive of left and right on more narrowly economic terms, I don't think makes as much sense in that way. I mean, whether you want to call it provincialism versus cosmopolitanism, that would be one way of looking at it as well, which you could use the analogy there with Brexit and Trump as well, what that main divide looks like. I mean, left and right, we use that as a shorthand, even though, of course, as we both know, that those terms are, temporally actually quite fragile terms. I'm
just wondering about the Conservative coalition and the way that this was brought together. I mean, their groups of voters didn't necessarily. You could say that they held together because actually they got an increase in their vote share to 43%.
Yeah, no, definitely.
The Conservatives have had this long-term problem with the vote. They hit their rock bottom point in 1997, on 31%. And even when David Cameron finally managed to sort of win an election in 2010, he's still only getting 37,
right,
I think, or thereabouts,
yeah.
and then 38%
Yep.
last time round in 2015. Now they've got 43%, actually puts them on a greater percentage of the vote than Margaret Thatcher's 1983 share when she got a landslide. It's just that she was up against a divided opposition,
Of course,
and they're
of
up
course.
against an opposition that's only 3 points
But
behind.
43 is probably the new 36.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, a bit like expanding wastelands or whatever.
But
I think.
part of this is about how many parties are there, what the
Yeah, of
slice of the pie is like.
Of course, you
is
can
only
lose an
all-
election now and get 40% of the vote. I mean, that so much is quite obvious. But I mean, going back to the Conservatives. I mean, I suppose in some respects, because we talked about Labour, the Conservatives are the very obvious inverse. But I mean, one obviously very topical issue, which is obviously going to be coming up now. We're talking about the election, I suppose, not what's immediately going to happen to Theresa May and whether she should resign and all of those sorts of things. I mean, maybe in some respects we should probably park those kind of questions, because I don't really see how she could resign and the Conservatives have a leadership contest to choose the Prime Minister amongst themselves,
I
which
think
would
the,
be crazy.
the situation could be updated very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not going to risk that. But we have to remember, though, that I mean the three elections in the 2010s have, in some respects, between Labour and Conservative, actually all being quite relatively close and haven't seen that much change. And in absolute terms, the Conservatives got 43% of the vote, and whatever number of seats they end up with, 317 or whatever it is. In many respects, it's just simply relative to the expectation that they had. I mean, had they got exactly that result in 2010, that would have been a very satisfactory result for them. But not against this expectation, and of course the general election.
The closeness is an interesting point, because you've had 3 parliaments. 2 of them hung parliaments,
Yep.
and one of them has a majority of 12.
Exactly.
This is knife-edge politics of a kind we haven't seen in decades. And when it has happened, if we look at some of the previous decades with knife-edge politics, like the 70s, like the 20s, they tend to be very short-lived. You tend to have one parliament that was unstable, and then an immediate snapping back into huge majorities. And we're not getting that at the moment. Maybe that's the way things will move in the future.
Maybe it's a question, though, I suppose, of how often the government actually loses votes and the impression of instability. I think that might be one of the issues. I mean, how many votes did the Conservatives lose from 2015 to 2017 with a majority of 12? I haven't think
even looked,
maybe none.
It's amazing.
And of course, the coalition was.
They may have increased it because their vote share has gone up, of course, from 38 to 43. So I'd be very interested in seeing what.
Yeah, so you might get parliamentary stability. I mean, obviously the Irish were on the phone pretty quickly to go and do their deals. But shall we move on to one of the other parties here? I guess we should probably.
Can I just flag up one thing actually that comes to mind, which is maybe it's going back to the Labour Party, but it's how awkward this result is for the Labour right.
Oh,
because,
yeah, of course, yeah.
The standard narrative we've had is Labour can't possibly win with Corbyn. It's going to be a complete disaster. And,
so
Gordon
now they
Brown,
have to sit down and shut up.
Yeah, Gordon Brown got about 29% on the basically
Yes.
Blairite platform. Ed Miliband got about 30.5% on a basically Blairite platform. And Jeremy Corbyn comes along, apparently as loser who's going to be Michael Foot Mark II, and gets 40%. He gets more than Blair did in his third term.
Absolutely. Oh no, that's certainly true. And so it will be interesting to see how those, those who have criticised Corbyn, a very, very considerable number of them, they must find a way of presumably reconciling their previous criticism and yet being able to row back from it simultaneously. I mean, one of the ways in which they might find this, or this might be seen as being a little bit too critical of Corbyn, I guess might be to say something like, okay, we maxed out the protest vote here, but we need more to become a party of government, and that's when the mysterious swing voter that you need to capture comes. Although, of course, if you go after the swing voter, you might lose some of the voters that you've got right now, which is one of the other problems.
Swing voters. Shall we? The SNP?
Let's talk about the SNP. I mean, the SNP have really done very badly, again, compared to expectations,
relatively
of course.
speaking.
Yeah, they've won 35 seats, and they were jolly lucky to get 35. They got a lot by, I think they got 5 by tiny margins.
If we were talking 2 years ago and we were comparing this to the SNP's historic position, where I don't think they'd got more than 6 seats up until that point.
And I think those 6 seats that they had in 2010, I believe, I think that they've lost the majority of those. So they've lost Banff, they've lost Moray, they've lost...
Gordon's gone?
Yeah, that's true as well.
Both seats that Alex Salmond has represented as their major celebrity prior to Nicola Sturgeon have both gone. Which seems to suggest, and maybe this is something relevant to the Lib Dems actually, and the poor retention rate that Lib Dems have in passing on seats from one MP to another. maybe there's something of personality politics, certainly historically. I don't know whether that applies to the explosion of the SNP in 2015. And that
the weird thing, though,
way.
is that I would imagine, if anything, that those seats that the SNP historically held for a long time would be ones where there was a long-standing tradition of voting SNP. So I can imagine that I was thinking that the swing backs would be by far the largest. And the interesting thing is, they say that some of those more reliable SNP seats are some of the ones that have gone.
Yeah.
And that, in a certain kind of sense, you could say that was a very small nationalist core group and this hugely expanded periphery, of which they've obviously managed to hang on to the vast majority of it. But the point really we made before is that the battle lines are now much closer between the SNP and Labour, specifically.
What we've seen in Scotland is a very different political culture. Is if you look in England and Wales, mostly England, you're seeing a polarisation with, as you say, 83% of the vote now going to the two main parties. In Scotland, you're getting 3-4-way politics in a whole bunch of seats. You're getting, yes, the SNP took these seats on 55-60% last time around. This time around, they're holding them on 35% in many cases.
Oh, that's definitely true. But the interesting thing, of course, is that the main Labour to Conservative battle, which would be engaging the vast majority of the electors in Great Britain, it no longer applies in any of the Scottish seats because the SNP was either the nearest place challenger, obviously the incumbent, and so hence Scotland has existed on a completely different political body clock now. And so that, in many respects, just immediately then goes out of the window. But I think you're right, though, that some of the SNP holds are on a very, very low percentage of the vote, and as a consequence it would be... One other thing I think is interesting about Scotland is I assumed that when I saw the exit poll, this means there's been a unionist realignment. This means that it's finally happened. Conservatives are voting Labour and Labour are voting Conservative. Not so much so with the Lib Dems, because they're usually a less offensive sort of repository, I guess. But that is not really what happened. What happened was the Conservatives just took a huge chunk out of the SNP and Labour managed to hold static. If the unionists start
we have yet to see how the
tactically
cross-voting works.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm just going on the raw figures, and I know that's simplistic, but I expect that the general picture is still true. If the unionists, I mean, in some of the seats where, for example, the SNP managed to get home on 35% or whatever it is, then the third place party, may collapse to the second. I think it depends how menacing the SNP are. If the SNP seem to be, shall we say, damaged goods and going downhill, I don't think a Conservative in third place in whatever constituency is going to really want to vote Labour, and vice versa. So that may end up not happening. But I think the real takeaway, though, of Scottish politics is that the SNP dominance does appear to be challenged, and it's not just the decline in seats, it's the changing of the battlefront. Labour can get Scotland back now, basically. And that's, to be honest, one of the best pieces of news for a Labour supporter.
Yes, and I don't
it's
think
no longer gone.
We wouldn't have thought that was believable even 2 years ago.
Corbyn has managed. I mean, it's not really all Corbyn. I think the Tories are having a large to do with this as well. But that has really helped them. Shall we move on to talk about the Lib Dems now?
Yeah. I mean, this has been a weird campaign for them, because at the beginning there was talk of a liberal revival and all of this, and there was talk of getting 20 plus seats, all these kinds of things.
Capitalising on the sort of disaffected Remain vote.
And their poll rating tumbled, and that faded down to them losing seats as being an expectation. Being down to about 3 was one prediction, or being down to 5.
Was that your prediction, Seth? 3 predictions?
I didn't necessarily wholly disagree with it. That was based on...
Took a sweepstake on the most pessimistic prediction.
It often pays to do that with the bookies. No, that was based on the number of current seats of the 9 that they held that they would hold on to, and depending on what the churn would be like and how many gains that they would make. And indeed, actually, they find that of the 12 seats that they gained, the majority are new seats. They did lose an awful lot of seats, but then they held on to a number. Norfolk North wasn't meant to be a hold, according to most pundits. Carshalton Wallington was meant to be a safe, home and dry thing for the Conservatives. And then you had some very unusual sort of performances as well. Oxford Western Abington overturned a majority of nearly 10,000.
That's one of the real constituencies where I think you can say very squarely that. And one of the factors here is how important Brexit is, and I suspect myself and Seth might disagree about that. But that's a constituency where clearly the referendum has to have had a big effect.
Well, and yet demographically, it's quite comparable to Cambridge, where the Labour majority of Lib Dems went from 599 to, I think, over 10,000.
But this is one of the amazing tightropes that Labour have been managed to walk through. They haven't alienated the UKIP vote returning, and they've managed to take the disaffected Brexit vote simultaneously. not through a brilliant plan, but just through indecision.
Yeah,
sometimes one can stumble upon the right path blindfolded.
Yes,
maybe they did.
That's very
that.
Earl of Derby. But that's, I suppose, the key point actually is one was Labour facing and one was Conservative facing, and this sort of coalition would work in one seat but not another. It's hard to see whether it's a good or a bad result for the Liberal Democrats, because there are some obvious areas of vulnerability. Their vote share hasn't gone up a huge amount. It seems to have stood more or less still. On the other hand, they've improved their numbers by 1.5, which isn't bad. You know, they've gone from their 1972 numbers to their 1973 numbers.
Also, I mean, we're just looking at seats here, but as far as I'm aware, and again, haven't crunched the figures, I don't think that there's much evidence of a Lib Dem, with the exception of Bath, which is a little bit of a strange constituency with its own microclimate. Yep. I don't think the Lib Dems have any really large advances in the West Country. Or am I wrong about that? Maybe they have got a couple that are a little bit better.
Well, relatively backwards in the West Country because the Conservative vote increased. And there was an increase
and
in the
Labour vote increased as well. In places I believe like St Ives, Camborne and Redruth, and even Truro as well, Labour actually do really well and get into a big third place.
This is where the increased turnout does all sorts of really weird things.
Yeah.
So the Lib Dem vote was going up in the West Country, it's just the Conservative vote was going up even more.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily that the Labour vote was being squeezed, because that was going up as well, noticeably in line with national trends. The UKIP vote was certainly being squeezed to some extent, and part of it was new voters, and that'll be the interesting thing, actually. Who are these new voters? Because, they may well be people in urban centres, as per the sort of Corbyn stereotype. I don't think it's just that, though. No. There are all sorts of seats which don't have particularly young populations. They're not full of hipsters and so on, and yet they have noticeably shaken things up. And one of the cast iron rules of politics we all thought we knew was that snap elections always have small turnouts with all sorts of funny goings on. Well, actually, the turnout went right up for this election.
Yep. That's very, very interesting. And I think what you say there about those kind of demographics is very interesting. I mean, I expect that they will be able to isolate the young people as being one demographic, but at the same time, there are going to be other demographics which are also important here. Now, how that stacks up, and whether we end up with almost a more, as a consequence of the very regionally divergent swings here, we can't so much talk about A, social class, or B, even affluence. We may end up with an understanding of politics which is a little bit maybe sort of more US identity politics in a way where it's mapped out towards certain kind of groups, and that may be the best way of making sense of this.
Well, indeed, the party's already doing that, particularly with digital strategy, and it's very interesting actually seeing how digital strategy at the 2015 election was a Conservative monopoly, effectively. If you look, for example, as a proxy at the Facebook spending figures, Conservative Party spent about £1.2 million compared to the Labour Party's £100,000. Obviously, we don't know the spending figures now, but there's some rather interesting data around just the sheer prominence of online advertising, YouTube, Google ads, all of these things, as well as Facebook, heavily targeted things. And the Labour Party seems to have actually exceeded, as far as I can see, the Conservative Party's output.
Well, look, we certainly know that the Labour Party, in terms of the sort of the retweet wars and the social media wars, winning hands down. But the thing is, that's of course not the same as the targeted advertising.
Yeah, but the received wisdom from 2015, certainly one of the lessons drawn in the Nuffield study then, was Labour invested heavily in Twitter, Conservatives invested heavily in Facebook, and Twitter was this echo chamber that didn't actually bring any extra levels of support and was a bit of a damp script for them. And Facebook turned out to be brilliant in terms of targeted data. There are all sorts of really interesting findings there, maybe around there. I mean, personally, as somebody living in the Greenwich and Woolwich constituency, I found myself getting targeted ads for Croydon Central, Enfield North, Ilford North, Hampstead and Kilburn, Ealing Central. I don't think I've set foot in Croydon Central in about 5 years, so I don't even know I was getting these, but there's something actually about how poor the targeting is on this. I wonder if we're sort of over-imagining some of this and the effectiveness of it. And if that's the case, then perhaps boots on ground do matter, in which case actually numbers of members matter.
I think so. I mean, sometimes those kind of... there's of course always been, I think, for a very long time when the internet started to appear in people's houses, an assumption that e-government or e-campaigning was going to be really, really influential. And then, of course, in the age of social media, it again seemed... I think the bubble was going out of it, and then Trump appeared as the first, super social media kind of go seemingly understood it, and then, of course, suddenly it then was put back into fashion again. But no, I do think it's really, really, really interesting. But at the same time, it may, as you say, just simply be these kind of things may flatter to deceive in many ways, and then it may simply come to this boots on the ground thing. Although, of course, whether the boots on the ground are, of course, sustainable is, of course, then another matter.
Well, that's a good question, actually, in terms of when we try and draw lessons from elections, and
Yeah.
I mean the SNP's rise in 2015 is a great case. We say we've got this wonderful, bold new era, this huge popular vote has happened, the boundaries have been changed forever, and actually it doesn't last.
Yeah.
And so there's a question as to, is a youth coalition, I mean, let's look at young voters, for instance.
Yes.
Undoubtedly, young voters have been mobilised in a way that's really rare. You've got a bit of it in maybe a dozen constituencies for the Lib Dems in 2005, after tuition fees and all these things. This has been much, much bigger and much more decisive. But if you're looking at young voters, you need to persuade a whole bunch of 18 to 25-year-olds from scratch every time if you want to keep that up.
Because the demographic changes. I mean, we really, when we talk about, I think we're primarily 18 to 24 is the most important. I mean, 25 to 34 is important too, but it not so much so as this first demographic. But as you say, they change in each general election.
And you retain them. I mean, that's the thing. You know, as they become 25 to 34-year-olds, for instance, do they change in their politics?
Do they
go as well? Again, looking at that generation of, and the Lib Dems got their first demographic in 2005. It's the first time they were actually leading in any age group. It was the under 25s, and they decisively lost them after 2010, 2011, tuition fees and so on.
What do you think that the Lib Dem performance is likely to be like amongst that demographic in this election?
Abysmal.
Really abysmal.
Yeah. And you need only look at Cambridge, for instance, where there was a very high student turnout to see that. And that's the seat which had a phenomenally good student vote for the Lib Dems in 2005 and 2010, and was deserted by the students.
It's a fickle beast, though, the student vote. I mean, again, one thing with youth turnout is it is fickle. That's the thing, and youth support is quite fickle. And I think the nature, one thing I think is, this is just a suspicion, a gut feeling. I think the Corbyn coalition, it feels as though it's been, I don't know, pumped up and inflated and was able to get itself out this time. Whereas the Conservative coalition, you know, while it didn't do as well as we expected, I sense will be more solid.
Is this something?
Will the Labour one come back, I suppose, or will the youth just?
But is that a danger of left-wing coalitions in general? I mean, particularly, you know, the Conservatives have been in power for more than 2/3 of the last century.
Well, progressive coalitions, whatever you want to call them. I mean, this traditionally was, of course, one of the problems that the Liberal Party used to have. They much more reliant on
problem in 1945 for Labour, problem for Labour in 1966.
Dependent on enthusiasm, and of course for candidates for funding, but then also for for boots on the ground as well. I mean, that was always the traditional. I think it always sat very easily with the way that progressive parties like to see themselves as being dependent on this huge enthusiasm against a small amount of vested interest. In a low interest election, their money would just count for so much.
I mean, funding you mentioned, and that's an interesting dimension to this, because it's been very noticeable that in this campaign the Conservatives had a massive lead in terms of the declared fundraising during the campaign. And you know, there's not been the opportunity, as with previous elections, for parties to amass war chests in preparation, because none of them was prepared. This is in stark contrast, because one of the interesting things that's not generally appreciated is that if you do account for gifts in kind, payments in services, all these kinds of things, Labour's actually been significantly outraising the Conservative Party for most of the last few general elections, and that says something about how poor their campaigning is, that they've actually had more money than the Conservatives. Now, this doesn't usually fit into the narrative of all the Tories by-elections and Labour and the party of people who are and they're terribly impoverished. Actually, Labour's rolling in cash because they've still got quite a bit of business, big business donations, in addition to trade union money, in addition to state funding through short money, Cranbourne money, and so forth. And all of that makes for a larger sum than what the Conservatives themselves raise just through big business donations, primarily.
If that's interesting, why does that interpretation not filter through into the national media? Because more or less everyone, including politically informed people, think, the Tories have got...
Well, we could go into all sorts of conspiracy theories. I think it's... No. I'm fine for now, thanks.
I wouldn't mind some tea. Some tea would be charming, and some caffeine. Before we get on too much onto the funding thing, because I know it's a favourite topic. Unless you had one other point.
I was just going to say that I don't favour the conspiracy theory. I just simply think it's not an area that's been studied in any great detail beyond a few academics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, outside of, I guess, the main parties that we've covered now, I mean, there's not an enormous amount to say, really. I mean, Plaid Cymru were very lucky to get 4 seats that did not do well at all, and Welsh nationalism continues to be really a damp squib in the extreme. And apart from that,
they gained 1 seat, you know.
Yeah, well, that I think that Ceredigion, which
is a former seat of theirs,
indeed, exactly. Aside from that, and then you've got, I suppose, then in Northern Ireland, which is of some significance in the sense that it is relevant because the DUP have got 10 seats, which in a way is quite convenient for the the incoming government because they can negotiate with the whole block of them.
Yep.
Also, Sinn Féin have got 7 seats, so that's 7 abstentions.
Yes, but
they've wiped out the SDLP completely.
After all the Conservatives' attacks on Jeremy Corbyn for his links to Sinn Féin and the IRA, I really don't see the government depending on Sinn Féin votes to survive.
Well, Sinn Féin not being there, I thought it was quite funny that the DUP issued a statement really early in the night, which was basically a kind of.
They also took down their manifesto from their website, apparently. But given how extremely litigious the DUP is, I don't think we should discuss them in any great detail.
Also, I suppose, like the DUP. Well, okay, we won't discuss it in great detail. But shall we say, despite their high-minded principles, that the pork barrel is always fairly close to there.
You might well think that. I'm
you
sure
couldn't possibly comment. Anyway, so we will see what the DUP do. But essentially, you've gone back to, with the exception of one independent unionist in North Down, you've got 7 Sinn Féin and 10 DUP. Two-party politics have actually then reappeared in Northern Ireland as well, with the 2 hard unionist
very
and hard
noticeable,
nationalist parties.
very noticeable. As is the increasing Sinn Féin base, which we saw in the most recent Northern Ireland elections, only a shade of a percentage point off actually winning the election.
That's interesting. Because Northern Irish politics, and I think my one comment about Northern Ireland, which I think is quite interesting, is that even during the leaders' debates in this election, and I believe in the last ones, the multi-tier one where there were lots of different parties, the Northern Irish parties weren't there, even though you had the Greens and you had Plaid Cymru, who obviously are a regional party, and yet they've got a lot less MPs than the DUP have, for example. The Northern Irish parties were just somehow excluded because they were just a bit weird and peripheral. Now suddenly everyone's very interested in Northern Ireland again, because now suddenly the DUP actually matter again. God,
shades of the
Northern Ireland with that. What was that strange cake with the gay bakery or something? Just the level of information on what's happening in Northern Ireland, I think is